I never imagined there would come a day when my stepson would take my husband's shoes, pretending to be him while I was asleep, even down to the goodnight kiss. What happened next was far more dangerous and exciting than I ever expected. It all began when my husband wasn't home, and I found myself alone with Nathan. The night it first happened, I remember waking up to the faintest touch, a hand brushing softly against my shoulder. I stirred, disoriented, caught between the fog of sleep and the awareness of someone close to me. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Robert, my husband, often worked late, and on the nights he came home in the early hours, he would gently wake me with a kiss or a caress before slipping into bed beside me. I assumed this was one of those nights. The room was dim, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The familiar woodsy scent of his cologne, always slightly intoxicating, lingered in the air. His hand slid over my arm, his lips grazing my forehead. "Robert?" I murmured, my voice groggy. "Shoo," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." The warmth in his tone was soothing, and I felt myself relax. I didn't even register the slight oddities. The weight of his body leaning over mine, the subtle shift in his breathing. It was only when his lips moved from my forehead to my cheek, trailing down toward the corner of my mouth, that something felt different. Comfortably. "What are you doing?" I murmured, barely opening my eyes. "You looked cold," he said softly. His breath was warm against my skin. The words were innocent, but the way they were delivered sent a faint ripple of unease through me. Before I could say anything more, he pressed a kiss to the corner of my lips. Gentle, tentative, as though testing the waters. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything. The scent wasn't quite as familiar as I'd thought. The touch wasn't Robert's. His hands were rougher, calloused from years of work. These hands were softer, hesitant. And then there was the weight pressing down on the bed beside me, lighter, less familiar. I opened my eyes fully, and the moment I saw his face, my stomach dropped. "Nathan?" My voice was barely a whisper, strangled by confusion and an undercurrent of fear. He froze, his expression unreadable in the low light. For a whisper, strangled by confusion and an undercurrent of fear. He froze, his expression unreadable in the low light. For a moment, he didn't move, as though hoping that if he stayed still long enough, I might convince myself it hadn't happened. But there was no mistaking it now. My stepson, Nathan, was sitting on the edge of my bed, his face inches from mine, his hand still resting on my shoulder. "What are you doing?" I asked again, my voice sharper this time. "I thought you were having a bad dream," he stammered, quickly pulling his hand back. "I just wanted to check on you." I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, this isn't appropriate, you shouldn't be in here." "I'm sorry," he mumbled, standing abruptly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Before I could say anything else, he turned and slipped out of the room, closing the door behind him. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? I was certain of what had just happened. Why? What had compelled him to? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. Under our roof. Maybe he hadn't meant anything by it. Maybe he was just lonely, looking for some kind of connection. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Nathan had been living with us for 6 months. He had moved in after dropping out of college, citing a need to find himself. Robert had been reluctant at first. Nathan had always been a bit of a loner, struggling to maintain friendships or hold down a job. But I had convinced him it was the right thing to do. "He's your son," I had said. "He needs support right now. Maybe this is his chance to turn things around." At first, everything seemed fine. Nathan was quiet and kept to himself most of the time. He spent hours in his room, his door always closed, or wandered the neighborhood aimlessly. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were short and clipped. I tried to be patient, to draw him out of his shell. I invited him to join me in the kitchen while I cooked, encouraged him to watch TV with me in the evenings, and even offered to help him update his resume. But no matter how hard I tried, he remained distant. Polite, but distant. It wasn't until recently that I began to notice the subtle changes. The way his eyes lingered on me a little too long when we were in the same room. The way his eyes lingered on me a little too long when we were in the same room. The way he always seemed to appear when I was alone, offering to help with mundane tasks or asking questions that didn't really require answers. At first, I dismissed it as harmless. Just a young man who didn't know how to navigate social interactions. But after that night, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Nathan was back to his usual self, quiet, reserved, almost shy. He avoided eye contact as he passed me in the kitchen, mumbling a quick good morning before retreating to his room. I considered telling Robert about what had happened, but what would I even say? That Nathan had kissed me? That he had sat on my bed in the middle of the night, pretending to be him? It sounded absurd. And what if I had misunderstood? What if it really was just a harmless misunderstanding? I didn't want to cause unnecessary tension between father and son, especially not when their relationship was already so fragile. So, I decided to let it go. But the unease didn't go away. That night, Robert had to work late again, leaving me alone in the house with Nathan. I tried to distract myself, burying myself in a book, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that moved in the corner of my vision, felt like confirmation that something was about to happen. When I finally went to bed, I locked the door behind me. It wasn't something I usually did, but I told myself it was just to make myself feel safer. Nothing more. Hours passed, and I drifted in and out of sleep. The house was silent, save for the occasional hum of the heater kicking on. I told myself everything was fine, that I was overreacting, but then I heard it. A faint knock at the door. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the knock came again, louder this time. "Mom?" Nathan's voice was soft, hesitant. "Are you awake?" I didn't respond. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to stay quiet. After a moment, I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall, and I exhaled shakily. But then, just as I began to relax, I heard the doorknob rattle. My blood turned to ice as I realized what he was doing, trying to open the door. When it didn't budge, he knocked again, harder this time. "Mom, please," he said, his voice cracking. "I just want to talk." I stayed silent, clutching the blanket tightly around me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of his footsteps faded, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following day, I confronted him. I waited until Robert had left for work, and then I cornered Nathan in the kitchen. "What were you doing outside my room last night?" I asked, my voice firm. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to talk," he said. I couldn't sleep. "Then why did you try to open the door?" I demanded. He hesitated, his eyes darting away. I don't know, I wasn't thinking." I stared at him, trying to read his expression, but it gave nothing away. Finally I shook my head, but it gave nothing away. Finally, I shook my head. "Nathan, this has to stop. Whatever you're doing, it's not okay." "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry if I scared you." But the way he looked at me, like he was daring me to say more, sent a chill down my spine. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. At first, it was the fear, the shock of waking up and realizing that it had been him and not Robert in my bedroom. But as the days passed, those emotions gave way to something more complicated, something I didn't want to admit to myself. Something I didn't want to admit to myself. Nathan was always around. Quiet, watchful, but attentive in a way that Robert hadn't been in years. He noticed when I seemed stressed and offered to help with chores. He complimented me on the smallest things. A new dress, the way I styled my hair. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself he was just trying to be polite. But the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered. It wasn't the kind of attention a stepson usually gave his stepmother. There was a part of me, a deep, hidden part that felt flattered. Robert and I had been married for 5 years, but the spark between us had faded long ago. He was often busy with work, distracted and distant, and I had grown used to feeling invisible. Nathan's attention, however subtle, reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years. Desire. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Nathan came downstairs. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans.
Get tighter around me, but the thoughts wouldn't go away. The next morning, Nathan and I were alone in the kitchen. Wouldn't go away. The next morning, Nathan and I were alone in the kitchen. I was making coffee, still groggy from a restless night, when he walked in. He was shirtless, his jeans slung low on his hips, and I felt my pulse quicken before I could stop it. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the coffee pot, but I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my skin tingle. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Not really," I admitted. I couldn't seem to shut my brain off. He nodded, as though he understood. "I get that.
Sometimes it feels like the quiet is too loud, you know?" I glanced at him then, surprised by his words. There was something vulnerable about the way he said it, something that made me feel a pang of guilt for the way I had been thinking about him. But it also made me feel closer to him, as if we shared some unspoken connection. feel closer to him, as if we shared some unspoken connection. "Yeah," I said softly, "I know what you mean." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the only sound the faint hiss of the coffee maker. Then, as if on impulse, Nathan reached out and placed a hand on mine. His touch was warm, his fingers slightly calloused, and it sent a jolt through me. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know," he said, his voice low. "I'm here if you ever need anything." I didn't pull my hand away. I couldn't. Instead, I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. His eyes held mine, and I saw something there that both frightened and excited me, a hunger that mirrored my own. "I know," I whispered. He smiled again, that same crooked smile that made my knees weak, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. But before either of us could say anything more, the sound of the coffee pot clicking off broke the moment. I quickly pulled my hand away, turning back to the counter as if nothing had happened. But my heart was racing, and I knew he had felt it too. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way his hand had felt on mine. The intensity of his gaze. It was all I could think about. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend it hadn't happened. But another part of me, a darker, more desperate part, wanted more. When I finally drifted off to sleep, it was restless and filled with vivid dreams. Dreams of Nathan standing over me, his hand brushing against my cheek, his lips hovering just inches from mine. I woke up with a start, my skin flushed and my heart racing. I told myself it was just a dream, just my subconscious playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken tension. Nathan seemed to find reasons to be near me, helping me with chores, offering to cook dinner, sitting closer than necessary on the couch. And I didn't stop him. I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything, but every time his arm brushed against mine or his gaze lingered on my face, I felt the same electric pull. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he cornered me in the kitchen. The others had already gone to bed and the house was quiet. He stood close, too close. And I felt my breath hitch. "You've seemed distracted lately," he said, his voice soft. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't move. "Are you?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. Concern? Curiosity? Desire? I looked up at him then, and the intensity in his eyes made my knees weak. He stepped closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Nathan," I began, but he interrupted me. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know that I see you. I see how much you do. How much you care. And I care about you too." My heart was racing, and I knew I should step away and put some distance between us. But I stayed frozen in place, my breath shallow as his hand reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. I felt his fingers against my skin, his warmth, his presence, and I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. I wish I could say I stopped him that night, that I stepped back, drew the line, and reminded myself of what I stood to lose. But when Nathan's fingers brushed my cheek, and his lips hovered just inches from mine, I didn't move. I couldn't. The house was silent around us, the kind of silence that felt alive, pulsing with anticipation. I closed my eyes for just a moment, long enough to feel the faint warmth of his breath on my skin, and then, as if testing the waters, he pressed his lips gently to mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, as though he was giving me a chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I felt my body betray me, leaning into the kiss as if it had been waiting for it all along. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my heart was pounding too loudly to hear. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, full of questions and unspoken desires. Desires. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice shaking. "Don't apologize." I didn't recognize the person who had just spoken. Someone reckless, someone willing to risk everything for the way he made me feel. At that moment, I didn't care. All I knew was that Nathan saw me in a way Robert hadn't in years. He made me feel alive. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and rising guilt. We didn't talk about what had happened in the kitchen, but the unspoken tension between us grew thicker with each passing day. Every time I passed him in the hall or brushed against him in the living room, I felt the same electric pull, the same unrelenting desire, and I hated myself for it. Robert came home from his business trip a few days later, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that had settled over the house. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek and barely acknowledged Nathan, who avoided him as much as possible. I could see the strain in their relationship more clearly now. The way Robert dismissed Nathan's attempts at conversation. The way Nathan's eyes darkened whenever his father walked into the room. I told myself it was their dynamic that was causing the rift. That I was just caught in the middle. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was the one driving the wedge between them. One night, about a week after Robert's return, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. My heart immediately leapt into my throat, memories of that first night flooding back. I turned over to find Robert sound asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. Slowly, I sat up and listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and then I heard it. A soft, hesitant knock. My pulse quickened as I glanced at Robert, who didn't stir. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and padded over to the door. When I opened it, Nathan was standing there, his face half hidden in the shadows. His expression was a mixture of guilt and desperation. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice barely audible. I needed to see you. Nathan, this is." I glanced back at Robert, still asleep in the bed. "This isn't the time." "Please," he said, stepping closer. "Just for a minute." I hesitated, my heart racing. I knew I should send him away and tell him this had to stop, but the look in his eyes, the raw vulnerability, made it impossible to say no. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind me. "Me?" I asked, my voice cracking. He hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know I can't stop thinking about you." "You have to stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "This can't happen, Nathan." "It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Or is it only wrong because we're afraid of what people will think?" "It's wrong because I'm married to your father," I snapped, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "He doesn't see you," he said, his voice low. "Not the way I do. He doesn't appreciate you, doesn't care about how hard you work to keep this family together. You deserve better." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "What you're talking about," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't I?" he asked, reaching out to gently touch my arm. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I wanted more. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to give in, to let him kiss me again, to feel his arms around me, to lose myself in the intensity of his desire. But the thought of Robert sleeping just a few feet away snapped me back to reality. "This has to stop," I said firmly, stepping back. "We can't do this." His face fell, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that he would let me go and we could both move on. But as I watched him walk away, I knew it wasn't over, not for him and not for me. Over the next few weeks I tried to distance myself from Nathan. I avoided being alone with him, kept conversations short and focused on rebuilding my relationship with Robert. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Nathan, the way he looked at me, the way his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room with Robert, I caught Nathan watching me from the doorway. His eyes were dark and unreadable, his expression tense. I quickly looked away, but the damage was done. My heart was racing, and I knew he could see it. Robert, oblivious as ever, continued talking about his day, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I felt trapped, torn between the life I had built with Robert and the undeniable connection I felt with Nathan. The breaking point came one night when Robert announced he would be leaving for another business trip. As he packed his bags, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because his absence would make it easier to avoid suspicion. Dread because I knew that without him here, the line between Nathan and me would blur even further. When Robert left the next morning, I felt the tension in the house shift immediately. Nathan was quieter than usual, but his presence felt heavier, more suffocating. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning and organizing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen.
Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping, Brother John? Brother John. Morning bells are ringing, morning bells are ringing. Ding dang dong, ding dang dong. Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping, Brother John? Brother John. Morning bells are ringing, morning bells are ringing. Ding dang dong, ding dang dong. Are
And raw desire. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to stop, to push him away, to lock the door and never let this happen again. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, surrendering to the moment in a way that felt inevitable, almost fated. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, full of emotions I didn't dare name. "I've been waiting for this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't stop thinking about you." "Nathan, this isn't right," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "This can't happen." "It already has," he replied, stepping closer. "And you feel it too." "I know you do." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I felt it. The magnetic pull between us. The way his presence filled a void I hadn't realized was there. But the weight of what we were doing, of what this could cost us, hung heavy in the air. We can't, I repeated, my voice breaking. What about Robert? He's your father. He doesn't see you, Nathan said, his tone fierce. Not the way I do. He doesn't know how lucky he is to have you. The words cut deep, not because they were untrue, but because they were. Robert and I had been drifting apart for years, our marriage held together by routine and convenience rather than love. But that didn't make this any less wrong. You should go, I said finally, stepping back and putting distance between us. Before we do something we can't take back. For a moment I thought he might argue, but then he nodded, his jaw tight. I'll go, he said. But this isn't over. The next few days were agonizing. I avoided Nathan as much as possible, throwing myself into household chores and errands to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. His touch, his words, the way he looked at me. It was all I could think about. Robert called every evening from his trip, his voice distant and preoccupied, as he asked about the house and Nathan. I told him everything was fine, forcing cheerfulness into my tone, but the guilt gnawed at me. I was lying to him, betraying him in a way I'd never imagined possible. And yet, a part of me couldn't bring myself to regret what had happened. Nathan, for his part, seemed to respect my boundaries, at least on the surface. He kept his distance, only speaking to me when necessary and avoiding being alone in the same room. But I could feel his eyes on me whenever we crossed paths, could sense the unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't until the night before Robert's return that everything came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, trying to relax after a long day. The house was quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I had just started to feel the edge of my nerves dulling when Nathan appeared in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to say no. But something in his expression, an urgency I couldn't ignore, made me nod. "Okay," I said, setting my glass down. "What is it?" He stepped into the room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm sorry, but I can't keep acting like I don't feel the way I do." "Nathan, we've talked about this already," I said, my tone firm. "Whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not fair to Robert, and it's not fair to you." "Fair?" He laughed bitterly. "What's fair about any of this? Do you think I asked for this? Do you think I wanted to fall for you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but he didn't give me the chance. "I love you," he said, his voice raw, "and I know you feel something for me too. You can deny it all you want, but I see it in the way you look at me." My heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but I forced myself to stay strong. "Nathan, you're young. You're confused. This isn't love. It's infatuation. Don't do that," he snapped, his eyes flashing. "Don't dismiss what I feel like it's nothing. I know the difference." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You should go to your room," I said quietly. "We'll talk about this in the morning." But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I don't want to wait until the morning," he said. "I need you to tell me right now. Do you feel anything for me?" Or am I just imagining it? I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to lie, to tell him no and put an end to this once and for all. But when I looked into his eyes, I couldn't do it. The truth was written all over my face, and we both knew it. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice shaking. But you don't deny it, he said softly, a hint of hope in his voice. You feel it too. Before I could respond, he reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but insistent. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me, and I'll walk away. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, my resolve crumbling. And then, for the second time, his lips found mine. This kiss was different, more urgent, more desperate. It was the kind of kiss that made me forget everything else. That made the world fall away until there was nothing but the two of us. And for a moment, I let myself get lost in it. But then the sound of a door slamming shattered the illusion. I pulled back abruptly, my heart pounding as I turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, was Robert. The room fell deathly silent as the three of us stared at each other, the weight of what had just happened crashing down around us. I opened my mouth to explain, to say something, anything, but no words came out. Robert's gaze shifted from me to Nathan, his expression darkening. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Dad, I can explain, Nathan began. But Robert cut him off. Don't, he said, his voice cold. Off. Don't, he said, his voice cold. Don't say another word. Robert, please, I said, stepping forward. It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like, he repeated, his voice rising. I just walked in on my wife kissing my son, and you're telling me it's not what it looks like? I felt tears sting my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. I'm sorry, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for this to happen. Robert laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and empty. Well, it did, he said. And now we have to deal with it. He turned to Nathan, his fists clenched at his sides. Get out, he said. Pack your things and get out of my house. Dad, please, Nathan began. But Robert cut him off again. I don't want to hear it, he said, his voice shaking with anger. You're not my son anymore. You're nothing to me. Nathan's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, but then he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he was gone, Robert turned to me, his expression unreadable. And you, he said, his voice icy. I don't even know who you are anymore. His voice icy. I don't even know who you are anymore. Robert, please, I said, reaching out to him. I made a mistake. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. But he stepped back, his eyes cold. It's too late for that, he said. You've already destroyed everything. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what I had done. One night, crossing forbidden boundaries left us wrapped in emotions we could no longer deny. The house lay in a deep silence that seemed to press down on everything, the kind of stillness that makes even the walls feel alive with secrets. I lay there, eyes open, tracing the faint lines of moonlight stretching across the ceiling, my mind too restless to find peace. Tonight, memories swirled, how everything had shifted in this house, how our lives had turned upside down since Eric and his mom moved in. In this house, how our lives had turned upside down since Eric and his mom moved in. It's strange how life brings people together, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my stepson had somehow drifted even farther from me. It was an adjustment for both of us, and while I tried to get close, there always seemed to be this unspoken distance between us. I'd catch him glancing my way, spoken distance between us. I'd catch him glancing my way, almost as if he was sizing me up. But he'd never say much, just disappear back into his room. I wondered if he was feeling as out of place as I was. Tonight, though, was different. There was an unexplainable tension hanging in the air, something that made me feel like I was waiting for something to happen. Something that made me feel like I was waiting for something to happen. The soft creak of a floorboard snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze, ears straining, sure that I'd imagined it. But there it was again, a light, almost tentative footstep coming from somewhere down the hallway. I glanced over at the clock on my nightstand. It was well past midnight. Who else could be up at this hour? I considered getting up, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe just plain curiosity. But I found myself lying there, holding my breath, listening to the faint sounds of someone moving down the hall. My heart picked up, that familiar thrill of tension taking over, and I couldn't help but wonder who it could be. The sounds grew closer, pausing just outside my door. I gripped the edge of the blanket, feeling my pulse quicken as the handle turned, and the door creaked open a sliver. For a moment, nothing happened. Just a sliver of darkness beyond the doorframe, as if someone were standing there, watching, waiting. I stayed absolutely still, wondering if maybe it was all in my head. Then, without a sound, the door eased shut, and I heard those same soft footsteps retreating back down the hall. I didn't move for a long time, my mind racing with questions. Has anyone been there? And if so, why would they come to my door only to leave without a word? After a few tense minutes, I finally convinced myself it was just my imagination. But no sooner had I settled back into bed than my phone lit up beside me. The screen glowed with a single message from Eric. "Can't sleep either," it read. I stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of relief and surprise. It was rare for Eric to reach out like that. He usually kept to himself, always guarded, always distant. I quickly typed back a response, but before I could send it, I heard the soft creak of the hallway floor again. My heart skipped a beat as the sound grew closer, coming to a stop outside my door. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but the silence stretched on, unbroken. I couldn't take it any longer. I slipped quietly out of bed, crept toward the door, and eased it open. something simmering just below the surface. "Alright, well, if you need anything, I'm just down the hall," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Eric nodded, but he didn't look at me. He was already back to staring at his phone, lost in his own world. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door he spoke, his voice so soft I almost missed it. "Thanks for checking on me." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I could feel his gaze on my back as I left, the weight of his unspoken words lingering in the air long after I had closed his door. I returned to my room, slipping under the covers, but sleep was a distant memory. The house felt different somehow, heavier, like it was holding on to secrets I couldn't quite unravel. I lay there, replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Why had Eric come to my door? Why had he looked at me like that, like he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to speak? And why did I feel like there was more going on than I could see? Just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Eric. "Good night," it read, simple and unassuming, but somehow it only made me feel more unsettled. I typed back a quick response, setting my phone on the nightstand and closing my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. The house was silent once again, but that tension, that strange feeling of something lurking just out of sight, remained, hanging over me like a shadow. And deep down, I knew one thing for certain. This night was only the beginning. The following morning felt surreal, as if the events of last night were nothing more than a strange dream that lingered in the corners of my mind. But as I made my way down the stairs, the weight of it all pressed in on me. The stillness of the house seemed thicker somehow, as if it held on to secrets we were both unwilling to speak out loud. When I walked into the kitchen, Eric was already there, leaning against the counter, his eyes fixed on a steaming mug in his hands. He glanced up as I entered, his expression guarded, and for a brief moment, I could see something flicker in his gaze, a mixture of hesitation and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Morning," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a strange tension settle between us. It was the same tension that had been there ever since we became a family, but today, it felt sharper, more palpable. I busied myself making coffee, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if his eyes were still on me. "Did you sleep?" I asked, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. He shrugged, taking a sip from his mug. "Not really. Couldn't stop thinking about things." His words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. There was so much left unsaid between us, so much we tiptoed around, pretending it wasn't there. But today, it felt like all those unspoken words were threatening to spill over, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at me since last night. "Eric, about last night. Eric, about last night. Did you come to my door?" He looked at me, his gaze steady, but there was something hidden behind his eyes. A hint of something vulnerable, almost conflicted. He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he nodded, a barely perceptible movement, as if he were admitting a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted to check on you, make sure you were okay," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I nodded, trying to make sense of his words. But there was something about the way he was looking at me, something that made my pulse quicken, an unspoken tension crackling between us like a live wire. "I appreciate it," I replied, forcing myself to maintain eye contact, though it felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. He held my gaze for a moment longer, his eyes searching mine as if he were trying to find something there. But then he looked away, his shoulders tense, as if he were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. The silence between us stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, and I found myself wondering what it was that kept him up at night. What it was that made him come to my door. There was a part of me that wanted to ask, to dig deeper, but another part that was too afraid of what I might find. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We went about our routines, moving through the same familiar motions, but there was a lingering tension in the air that neither of us could shake. I could feel his presence, a constant awareness that settled under my skin, making every interaction feel loaded with unspoken words. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves in the living room, each pretending to be engrossed in our own tasks, but I could sense his gaze flickering toward me now and then. I could feel the weight of his attention, like a physical presence in the room, and it made my heart beat faster, my breath catching in my throat. He was sitting on the couch, his head resting on his hand as he stared at the TV, though I doubted he was really watching. Head resting on his hand as he stared at the TV, though I doubted he was really watching. I couldn't help but steal a glance in his direction, and for a moment, our eyes met. His expression softened, and there was a vulnerability there, something that made my chest tighten. "You know it's weird," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I never thought things would be like this. Us, here, together." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something in his tone, a hint of regret, or maybe a longing for something different. "Yeah, life has a way of surprising you," I said, offering him a small smile. He looked down, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. "Sometimes I wonder if things had been different, you know? If we'd met under other circumstances, maybe things wouldn't feel so." He trailed off as if searching for the right word. Railed off, as if searching for the right word. "Tense?" I offered, and he gave a slight nod, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, tense," he echoed. His eyes meeting mine again, and there was a sadness there, a longing that made my heart ache. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him that things didn't have to be this way. But the words died on my lips. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I didn't know how to reach him, how to ease the tension that seemed to hang between us like a shadow. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of awkward silences and stolen glances. Every time I caught him looking at me, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a mixture of confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of something that could change everything, but neither of us dared to take the leap. Something that could change everything, but neither of us dared to take the leap. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way his eyes had softened, the way he'd seemed so vulnerable, so lost. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that he didn't have to go through this alone, but I didn't know how. Sleep was elusive once again, and I found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of him. I wondered if he was lying awake too, if he was thinking about me, about the tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. The hours ticked by, and just when I thought I might drift off, I heard it again, the soft creak of the hallway floor. My heart leaped, and I held my breath, listening as the footsteps drew closer, pausing just outside my door. This time, I couldn't stay still. I slipped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and opened the door. This time, I couldn't stay still. I slipped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and opened the door. Eric was standing there, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Eric," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, and for a moment we just stood there, staring at each other in the dim light of the hallway. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a rawness that made my chest tighten. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling the same restlessness, the same tension that had been building between us for days, weeks, maybe even months. Without thinking, I stepped aside, letting him into the room. He hesitated, but then stepped inside, his movements slow, almost hesitant. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, as we stood there, each of us searching for the right words. The words that might make sense of this strange connection we'd both been dancing around. But there were no words. Just a shared understanding. A silent acknowledgement of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. He looked at me, his gaze softening, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, something that felt like hope, or maybe relief, as if we were finally letting down the walls we'd both been holding up for so long. I didn't know what was happening between us, didn't know where this would lead, but as we stood there, the weight of our shared silence pressing down on us, I felt a strange sense of comfort. Like, for the first time, we were finally seeing each other, truly seeing each other, without the barriers we'd both put up. And though the air was thick with unspoken words, with questions we didn't dare to ask, I knew one thing for certain: whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The days blurred together, each one filled with the same tense silences and fleeting glances. I tried to go about life as if everything were normal, as if we hadn't crossed a line, one that, deep down, I knew would change everything. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I could feel it between us, an unspoken connection growing stronger with each passing day. I quickly typed back a response, but before I could send it, I heard the soft creak of the hallway floor again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but the silence stretched on, unbroken. I couldn't take it any longer. I slipped quietly out of bed, crept toward the door, and eased it open. The hallway was empty, but a faint light spilled out from the bottom of Eric's door at the end of the hall. 17 AR Pora. Evening had fallen, and the house was quiet. I was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly wiping down the counter, trying to keep my hands busy. Eric entered the room, and suddenly the air felt charged. There was a strange energy between us, an intensity that neither of us could ignore. He leaned against the doorway, watching me with a contemplative look, as if he were weighing something important. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation settling in my chest. "You always keep yourself busy, don't you?" he asked, a hint of a smile on his lips. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "It helps to pass the time." There was a pause, and I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze making my skin prickle with awareness. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing just a few inches away. "It must get lonely," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. I swallowed, the distance between us feeling both too close and not close enough. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely audible.
His gaze softened and I
For a moment, everything felt perfect. The doubts, the fears, the tension, all of it melted away, leaving only the pure, unfiltered desire that had been simmering between us for so long. It was as if we were finally allowing ourselves to feel, to let down our guard and embrace the emotions we'd both been hiding. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. I pulled away, breathing heavily, my mind racing as the gravity of what we'd just done sank in. Eric looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and vulnerability, as if he were trying to make sense of it all.
I don't know if this is. I trailed off, unable to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. He looked away, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. I'm sorry.
I shouldn't have. He stopped, shaking his head, as if he didn't know how to finish the sentence. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. No, it's not your fault, No, it's not your fault, This is complicated. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. Yeah, I know. It's just... Sometimes it feels like you're the only person who really understands me. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the connection we'd shared long before this moment, long before any lines had been crossed. There was a bond between us, something deep and unbreakable, and yet, it was that very connection that made everything feel so overwhelming, so impossible. We stood there in silence, the weight of our shared understanding pressing down on us. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if there was a way to move forward without losing everything we had. Finally, Eric broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should just pretend this never happened. I felt a pang of sadness at his words, but I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that there was nothing between us. But at the same time, we couldn't let this moment define us. We had to find a way to move on, to rebuild the boundaries that had been broken. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Maybe that's for the best. But as I said the words, a part of me knew that it wouldn't be that simple. You can't unfeel something once you've felt it, can't erase a connection once it's been made. And as I looked at him, standing there with that same conflicted expression on his face, I knew that this was far from over. In the days that followed, we tried to go back to normal, to pretend that nothing had happened. We went through the motions, each of us careful not to cross any lines, to keep our distance. But the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the connection we'd both tried so hard to ignore. And every time our eyes met, every time I caught a glimpse of that same vulnerability in his gaze, I felt a pang of longing, a yearning for something that could never be. One evening, as we sat in the living room, each of us lost in our own thoughts, he finally broke the silence. You know, it doesn't have to be like this. I looked up, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. What do you mean? He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I don't want to keep pretending. I don't want to keep running away from what I feel. His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart race, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside me. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way for us to make this work, to find a way to be together without losing ourselves in the process. But I also knew that life wasn't that simple. There were consequences, risks, things that could go wrong. And as much as I wanted to take the leap, I wasn't sure if I was ready. Wanted to take the leap, I wasn't sure if I was ready. I don't know, Eric, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to hurt myself. He nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I get it, I needed you to know how I feel." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of our shared understanding. We both knew that this was complicated, that there were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But as we sat there side by side, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the bond we shared. Whatever happened, whatever choices we made, I knew that this connection, this feeling, would always be a part of us. And in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to make it work. As the night stretched on, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But somehow, together in a way that felt deeper than words. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But it was real, and for now, that was enough. The days that followed were a blur, an uneasy mix of tension, shared glances, and unspoken words. Each interaction felt loaded, every silence brimming with emotions neither of us knew how to handle. We both tried to go about our routines, to act as though nothing had changed, but the weight of our unacknowledged connection made everything feel surreal, like living in a dream we couldn't wake from. Made everything feel surreal, like living in a dream we couldn't wake from. One evening, a chill had settled over the house, and I was on the porch, watching the last traces of daylight fade into the night. The sky was painted in hues of deep orange and purple, a beautiful scene that felt out of place against the turmoil swirling in my chest. Lost in thought, I didn't hear Eric approach until he spoke. "Do you ever wish things were different?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant, and I could feel the weight of his words before I even turned to face him. I looked over, surprised to see him standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his face partially shadowed by the fading light. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that took me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, "but life, it doesn't always give us what we want." A whisper. "But life, it doesn't always give us what we want." He nodded, his eyes fixed on a spot in the distance, his expression contemplative. "I know," he said almost to himself. "It just feels like we're both stuck, trapped in something we didn't ask for." The words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized just how much I understood what he was feeling, how deeply I shared the same longing for something different, something easier. But we were here, bound by the choices we'd made, by the lives we'd built, and there was no going back. "We just have to make the best of it," I said, forcing a smile. "Find a way to move forward." He looked at me, his gaze searching, as if he were trying to find an answer to a question he couldn't put into words. "I don't know if I can," he said finally, his voice filled with an honesty that caught me off guard. "I don't know if I can keep pretending." There was a pause, a silence that stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for something I couldn't name, and I realized that, deep down, I felt the same way. I was tired of pretending, of hiding behind walls that were crumbling with each passing day. "I don't want to pretend either," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I don't know what else to do." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. And in that moment, I felt the full force of our connection, a bond that had grown stronger with every passing day, every shared glance, every unspoken word. It was a connection that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries we'd both tried so hard to uphold. "I think we both know what we want," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced, a mixture of fear and longing swelling inside me. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written in the way my heart beat faster every time he was near, in the way my thoughts drifted to him at night, in the way his presence filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. Before I could respond, he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine, a touch so gentle it sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, and in that moment, I saw the same emotions reflected in his gaze. Fear, longing, and something deeper, something neither of us could put into words. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and I felt my breath catch, the world around us fading into the background. There was no denying it now, no hiding from the truth we'd both been running from. And as his lips met mine, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like both an ending and a beginning, I realized that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, as if we were both afraid to break the fragile connection between us. But as it deepened, as our bodies pressed closer, I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't contain, a longing that had been building for so long it felt like it might consume me. For a moment, everything else faded away, the fears, the doubts, the consequences. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this feeling that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But all too soon, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my heart racing, my mind reeling as I tried to process what had just happened. Eric looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and vulnerability, and I could see the same turmoil reflected in his gaze. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, feeling a wave of sadness wash over me. "I don't know, Eric. I really don't know." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of our shared understanding. We both knew that this couldn't continue, that there was no way to move forward without tearing apart the fragile stability we'd built. But the connection between us was too strong to ignore, too deep to simply walk away from. Finally, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look at him. Maybe we need some time, some space to figure things out." He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe that's for the best." The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. We kept our distance, avoiding each other as much as possible, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own regrets. The house felt empty, hollow, as if the connection we'd shared had left a void that nothing could fill. But as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. We both needed time to process what had happened, to figure out who we were without the weight of our unspoken feelings hanging over us. And slowly, painfully, life went on. We went about our routines, our lives settling back into a semblance of normalcy, though the tension between us never fully disappeared. There were moments, fleeting glances and shared silences, where I could feel the echo of what we'd shared, a reminder of the bond that would always be there, even if we never spoke of it again. One evening, months later, I found myself standing on the porch once more, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful, peaceful scene that felt almost surreal against the turmoil that still lingered in my chest. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, surprised to see Eric standing there, his expression soft, contemplative. We hadn't spoken about that night since it had happened. a quiet acceptance of everything we'd been through. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough. And as I looked at Eric, standing there with that same vulnerable expression, I knew that no matter what happened, we'd always have this connection, this understanding that went beyond words. We turned, walking back into the house, each of us carrying the weight of our shared history, our unspoken connection. It was a weight we'd carry for a long time, maybe even forever. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the bond we'd shared, and the knowledge that, no matter what, we'd shared, and the knowledge that, no matter what, we'd always have each other. I had never expected my stepmom would surprise me like that. I remember that day so vividly. It was a Saturday afternoon, just like any other. I had been in the garage for hours, losing myself in the familiar routine of fixing up my old bike. There was something soothing about it, the smell of oil and grease, the clink of metal against metal, the satisfaction of tightening that final bolt. I didn't need to think too much in the garage, and that was what I liked about it. Here, I could tune out everything else. I had moved back home recently, and while I didn't mind living with my dad, things had been different since he remarried. Emma, my stepmom, was a new presence in the house. She was in her late 40s, but you wouldn't have guessed it by looking at her. She carried herself with this air of elegance and grace, always perfectly put together. The way she moved, spoke, and even looked at you. There was something about her that commanded attention, but today was supposed to be a regular day, a day like any other, or so I thought. As I worked on my bike, tightening a bolt that didn't really need tightening, I heard the creak of the garage door. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It was probably just Dad coming to check on me, maybe to ask if I needed anything from the store. But then I heard her voice, soft yet confident in a way that made me pause. "You've been spending a lot of time here," Emma said, her tone light but curious. I glanced up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. She was dressed casually, in a light summer dress that clung to her in all the right places, her blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Even dressed down, she had this effortless style, like she was ready to grace the cover of a magazine without even trying. It was hard to ignore her, and I wasn't sure if I should try. "Just finishing up," I muttered, wiping my hands on an already oily rag. "Had to tighten a few things." She stepped into the garage, her heels clicking softly against the concrete floor. "You're always in here," she remarked, her eyes scanning the space. "What's so fascinating about this place?" I laughed nervously, trying to focus on my bike. "Not much. Just tools, grease, and a lot of half-finished projects." She smiled, that warm, knowing smile that I had seen her use on my dad so many times. It always seemed to lighten the room. But today, there was something different in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. She moved closer, leaning against the workbench just a few feet away from me. "You've been working hard lately," she said, her voice softening. "Don't you think you deserve a break?" Her words hung in the air, and suddenly, the garage felt a lot smaller. I could feel the weight of her gaze, and for the first time, I didn't see her as just my dad's wife. There was something else going on, something that I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. "Maybe," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I turned back to the bike, pretending to check the chain again, though I had already done it 3 times. Anything to avoid the intensity of the moment. She didn't seem to mind my avoidance. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand lightly brushing against my shoulder. The touch was so soft that, at first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I felt the warmth of her fingers trailing down my arm. A shiver ran down my spine. "You've grown up so much," she whispered, her voice barely audible but impossible to ignore. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma, Shoo, she said, stepping even closer. Her body was now just inches from mine, and I could feel the heat radiating between us. It's okay. Her hand moved up to my neck, and for a moment, everything around us seemed to blur. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the rational part of me was slipping away, replaced by something else, something that felt both dangerous and exciting. Then, before I could say anything, she leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it deepened. Her lips were warm and insistent, and suddenly all the thoughts I had been trying to hold on to scattered. My mind went blank. All I knew was that I wasn't pulling away. Her hand slid down to my chest, tracing the muscles beneath my shirt, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was surreal, like I had stepped into a dream. A dream I definitely did not want to wake up from. I knew this was wrong. I knew we shouldn't be doing this. But in that moment, none of it mattered. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Emma, I whispered, my voice shaky as I pulled away slightly, trying to regain some semblance of control. We shouldn't. Why not? She asked, her eyes locking onto mine, filled with a desire I hadn't seen before. Your dad's out for the day. It's just the two of us. Your dad's out for the day, it's just the two of us. I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't process. But her hand was still on me, her touch lingering. And with each passing second, the pull between us grew stronger. Her fingers toyed with the hem of my shirt, and before I could protest, she pulled it over my head. I was breathless, unsure of what to do, but her touch, her kisses, they were intoxicating. She pressed herself against me, her lips trailing down my neck, and I felt my knees weaken, the control I had fought for slipping through my fingers. Emma, I whispered again, but this time, there was no resistance in my voice. I was caught, helpless, in the magnetic pull of the moment. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. I've seen the way you look at me, she said, her lips grazing my ear. Don't think I haven't noticed. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat of her lips grazing my ear. Don't think I haven't noticed. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat of her breath against my skin. She was right. I had tried to ignore it, to push those thoughts away. But now, standing here with her so close, there was no denying it. I had been drawn to her, maybe since the day she moved in, but I had never allowed myself to admit it until now. Her hand slid lower, teasing the edge of my jeans, and I felt another shiver run down my spine. It was too much, too fast, but I couldn't bring myself to stop her. The world outside the garage seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us, caught in a whirlwind of emotions and desires I didn't fully understand. But even then, I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a strange blur, a mixture of confusion, excitement, and guilt. Every time I replayed what had happened in the garage, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, unsure whether I'd fallen off or was somehow still balanced. What had transpired between Emma and me was a line that should never have been crossed, and yet it had been crossed so easily. Too easily. I avoided her the best I could after that day. I kept to my room when I wasn't at work, and I spent even more time in the garage, though now the place that had once been my refuge felt like a minefield of memories I didn't want to revisit. I tried to focus on my bike, but every time I tightened a bolt or adjusted a part, I'd see Emma's face, hear her voice, feel her touch. It was maddening. Voice, feel her touch. It was maddening. Then there was my dad. He didn't notice a thing. How could he? He trusted Emma completely, and why wouldn't he? To him, she was perfect, kind, loving, everything he'd always wanted. And yet, she and I had shared something that felt impossible to explain, even to myself. How could I explain it to him? One evening, about a week later, Dad asked if I wanted to join them for dinner. My heart nearly stopped at the thought of sitting at the same table as Emma, pretending that nothing had happened. I mumbled something about not being hungry and said I had some work to finish in the garage. He didn't question it, just nodded and said they'd leave me some food. As I headed out to the garage, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me for days. The tension I had been trying to bury was only growing, and I knew deep down that avoiding Emma wasn't going to make it go away. Something had shifted between us that day in the garage, and pretending otherwise was becoming impossible. I wasn't out there for long when I heard footsteps again. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't my dad's familiar heavy stride. It was her. "Mind if I come in?" Emma's voice broke the stillness, and I froze. "Mind if I come in?" Emma's voice broke the stillness, and I froze. I didn't look up, keeping my focus on the bike in front of me. "What do you need?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed the tension inside me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, I felt her move closer, her presence unmistakable even before I saw her. When I finally looked up, she was standing beside me, arms folded, her presence unmistakable even before I saw her. When I finally looked up, she was standing beside me, arms folded, her gaze steady. "We need to talk," she said softly, "about what happened." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I had been dreading this moment, knowing that sooner or later we'd have to address what had happened. But the truth was, I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't even know how to think about it. "There's nothing to talk about," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. "It shouldn't have happened." Emma's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something that made my heart race in a way I didn't want to admit. That made my heart race in a way I didn't want to admit. "But it did," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "And we can't just pretend it didn't." I stood up, tossing the wrench I had been holding onto the workbench. "I don't know what you expect me to say," I said, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. "It was a mistake." Her eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite read. Maybe hurt, maybe anger, or maybe something else entirely. "Was it?" she asked, her voice almost too soft to hear. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to shout that yes, it had been a mistake, that it should never have happened and that we should both forget it. But another part of me, an unshakable part, knew that wasn't entirely true. The memory of her touch, her kiss, lingered in my mind like a weight I couldn't lift. And I couldn't deny that in that moment I hadn't wanted it to stop. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Emma stepped closer, her eyes locked onto mine. "I've been thinking about it nonstop," she said. "I can't get it out of my head." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "It's not right," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Her gaze softened, and she reached out, her hand brushing against my arm. "It doesn't feel wrong," she whispered, her touch sending a familiar shiver down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, torn between what I knew was right and what my body was telling me. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, to walk away. Just as my dad walked through the front door. I stood there, my heart pounding, wondering how everything had gotten so complicated so quickly. But as much as I wanted to, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Days turned into weeks, and I kept telling myself that the distance I had created between Emma and me would make everything go back to normal. But normal was nowhere in sight. Every time I sat down for dinner with my dad, every time Emma walked into the room, there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. It was like an invisible thread pulling us closer, even when we were supposed to be keeping our distance. I knew it was wrong. Wrong for my dad. Wrong for me. Wrong for everyone involved. But no matter how much I tried to suppress it, the feelings lingered. It was a Tuesday night when everything came to a head. Dad had been called away on a business trip that morning, leaving the house feeling emptier than usual. The silence only heightened the unease I had been feeling for weeks. I spent most of the evening in my room trying to distract myself with the television, but nothing could keep my mind from wandering back to that moment in the garage. That moment when everything had shifted between Emma and me. I thought I could avoid her like I had been doing. I could stay in my room, make excuses, and pretend that the connection between us had faded. But when I heard a knock on my door, my heart leapt in my chest. I knew it was her before she even spoke. "Can I come in?" Emma's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I hesitated, staring at the door as if it might provide me with an answer I didn't already have. Everything in me screamed that I should say no, that I should tell her to leave, that this had gone too far already. But my voice betrayed me. "Yeah, sure," I said, my throat dry. The door creaked open and she stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. She looked different tonight, more vulnerable, perhaps. She was wearing a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. There was none of the elegance or confidence she usually carried herself with. Instead, she seemed almost uncertain. "I didn't want to be alone tonight," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze as she sat on the edge of my bed. "With your dad gone, the house feels so empty." I swallowed hard, sitting up straighter. "I get it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It does feel different when he's not around." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was palpable, thick enough to cut through the silence. I could feel her presence next to me, the warmth of her body just inches away from mine, and it was taking everything in me not to close that distance. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Emma said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down at the floor. Me too. I know we said it shouldn't happen again, she continued, her voice wavering slightly. And maybe that's true, but I can't stop thinking about it. I felt a knot form in my throat. I knew exactly what she meant because I had been thinking about it too. Every day, every night, it was all I could think about. The memory of her touch, her kiss. It haunted me. But the guilt haunted me just as much. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice hoarse. It was wrong, Emma. We both know that. She nodded slowly, her eyes still avoiding mine. I know. But it doesn't feel wrong. That's the problem. I looked at her then, really looked at her. There was something in her expression that I hadn't seen before, something raw and conflicted. It wasn't just desire. It was fear, confusion, and something deeper that I couldn't quite place. We can't keep doing this, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I wasn't sure if I meant them. Emma shifted slightly, her eyes finally meeting mine. There was a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe desperation. Maybe we can't, she whispered, but what if we just don't think about tomorrow, just for tonight? Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew what she was asking, what she was offering, and part of me wanted to refuse, to stand up and walk away, but there was another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since that day in the garage, that couldn't resist. I reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. My fingers lingered against her skin, for a moment longer than they should have, and I saw her eyes flutter closed at the contact. The air between us crackled with tension, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no going back. Emma leaned in slowly, her breath warm against my cheek as she whispered, I don't want to stop. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could think about what I was doing, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to hers. Distance between us, pressing my lips to hers. The kiss was different this time. Softer, slower, but no less intense. It was as if we were both testing the waters, seeing how far we could go before the floodgates opened. She kissed me back, her hands moving to my shoulders, pulling me closer. Every rational thought I had dissolved in that moment, leaving only the two of us caught in a whirlwind of emotions that neither of us could control. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and all I could focus on was the feeling of her lips against mine, the way her body pressed against me, the way everything seemed to fall away except for this. To fall away except for this. We pulled apart briefly, both of us breathless, but it wasn't enough. She looked at me with those eyes filled with a desire that mirrored my own, and I knew that this was the point of no return. There was no more fighting it, no more pretending. Are you sure? I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in again, her kiss deeper this time, more insistent. I responded in kind, my hands moving to her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken feelings were pouring out in that kiss. And I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to. I thought I could avoid her like I had been doing. I could stay in my room, make excuses, and pretend that the connection between us had faded. But when I heard a knock on my door, my heart leapt in my chest. I knew it was her before she even spoke. I knew it was her before she even spoke. Can I come in? Emma's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I hesitated, staring at the door as if it might provide me with an answer I didn't already have. Everything in me screamed that I should say no, that I should tell her to leave, that this had gone too far already. But my voice betrayed me. Yeah, Sure, I said, my throat dry. The door creaked open and she stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. She looked different tonight, more vulnerable, perhaps. She was wearing a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. There was none of the elegance or confidence she usually carried herself with. Instead, she seemed almost uncertain. I didn't want to be alone tonight, she said quietly, avoiding my gaze as she sat on the edge of my bed. With your dad gone, the house feels so empty. I swallowed hard, sitting up straighter. I get it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It does feel different when he's not around. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was palpable, thick enough to cut through the silence. I could feel her presence next to me, the warmth of her body just inches away from mine, and it was taking everything in me not to close that distance. I'd been thinking a lot about what happened, Emma said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down at the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down at the floor. Me too, I know we said it shouldn't happen again, she continued, her voice wavering slightly, and maybe that's true, but I can't stop thinking about it. I felt a knot form in my throat. I knew exactly what she meant because I had been thinking about it too every day, every night. It was all I could think about. The memory of her touch, her kiss. It haunted me. But the guilt haunted me just as much. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice hoarse. It was wrong, Emma. We both know that. She nodded slowly, her eyes still avoiding mine. I know. But it doesn't feel wrong. That's the problem. I looked at her then, really looked at her. There was something in her expression that I hadn't seen before, something raw and conflicted. It wasn't just desire. It was fear, confusion, and something deeper that I couldn't quite place. We can't keep doing this, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I meant them. Emma shifted slightly, her eyes finally meeting mine. There was a flicker of something. Maybe hope. Maybe desperation. Maybe we can't, she whispered, but what if we just don't think about tomorrow, just for tonight? Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew what she was asking, what she was offering, and part of me wanted to refuse, to stand up and walk away. But there was another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since that day in the garage, that couldn't resist. I reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. My fingers lingered against her skin for a moment longer than they should have, and I saw her eyes flutter closed at the contact. The air between us crackled with tension, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no going back. Emma leaned in slowly, her breath warm against my cheek as she whispered, I don't want to stop. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could think about what I was doing, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to hers. The kiss was different this time. Softer, slower, but no less intense. It was as if we were both testing the waters, seeing how far we could go before the floodgates opened. She kissed me back, her hands moving to my shoulders, pulling me closer. Every rational thought I had dissolved in that moment, leaving only the two of us caught in a whirlwind of emotions that neither of us could control. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and all I could focus on was the feeling of her lips against mine. The way her body pressed against me. The way everything seemed to fall away except for this. We pulled apart briefly, both of us breathless, but it wasn't enough. She looked at me with those eyes filled with a desire that mirrored my own, and I knew that this was the point of no return. There was no more fighting it, no more pretending. Turn. There was no more fighting it, no more pretending. Are you sure? I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned in again, her kiss deep. After a couple more kisses, the tension started to change to something even more from what it already was. She got down while looking up to me and started, "We'll figure it out," I whispered, my hand resting against her cheek. Emma smiled softly while continuing. "I hope so," she whispered back, her voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight we had each other. And in that moment that was enough. Her touches and kisses changed into more. And we spent the night like you know how we spent it. Up till now in my life, it was the best night I had ever experienced. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. I woke up with the sunlight spilling through the blinds, a harsh reminder of how reality had set in. The weight of what had happened between Emma and me pressed down heavily on my chest. There was no escaping it now. It was real, and the consequences were lurking just around the corner. Lying there in the stillness, I replayed everything in my mind, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of regret, guilt, and, if I were honest, a longing that scared me. I didn't know what to do next, and for the first time in a long while, I felt utterly powerless. The sound of a door closing snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. Dad would be home soon, and the idea of sitting across from him, pretending like nothing had changed, seemed impossible. Emma and I hadn't spoken since last night. After everything, she'd slipped quietly out of my room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't stay in bed forever, though part of me wished I could. With a heavy sigh, I got up, pulling on a t-shirt and jeans, before heading downstairs. The kitchen was empty, the silence unsettling, but I could hear movement in the living room. My heart raced as I hesitated at the doorway. Emma was sitting on the couch, her posture tense as she stared blankly at the television, though it was clear she wasn't really watching it. For a moment I considered retreating back to my room, but running away wouldn't fix anything, it never did. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the living room. "Morning," I said quietly, my voice feeling out of place in the stillness. Emma looked up at me, her eyes filled with an uncertainty that mirrored my own. "Morning." The air between us was thick with unspoken words. I didn't know where to start. What could I possibly say to make sense of what had happened? And more than that, how could we even begin to address it? We need to talk, she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between us like an invisible barrier. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I nodded, though my stomach twisted into knots. Yeah, I know. She gestured to the chair across from her, and I reluctantly sat down, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them helpful. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of us said anything. The tension was unbearable. I'm sorry, Emma said at last, her voice soft but filled with emotion. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Neither did I. But it did. And now. I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Now what? What did we do from here? I never wanted to hurt anyone, she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. I never wanted to hurt anyone, she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. Especially not your dad. He doesn't deserve any of this. The mention of my dad made my chest tighten with guilt. He had no idea what was happening, no idea that the very foundation of his marriage was crumbling. The thought of him finding out was unbearable. But the truth was, we couldn't keep pretending. Sooner or later, this was going to come to light. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice cracking slightly. I can't just act like nothing happened, but I also can't be the one to hurt him like this. Emma's eyes flickered with pain and she looked away, her expression hard to read. I wish I could take it all back, I really do. But she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that nothing could erase what had happened, and the feelings that had grown between us couldn't just be swept under the rug. And the feelings that had grown between us couldn't just be swept under the rug. As much as I wished there was an easy solution, there wasn't. We have to stop this, I said firmly, though the words felt hollow. We can't keep whatever this is. Emma nodded slowly, though her eyes betrayed the inner conflict she was feeling. You're right, she said softly. We can't. But despite the words we were saying, the tension between us still simmered beneath the surface. It was like trying to put out a fire that had already consumed everything in its path. Even as we both agreed that this had to end, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. What about Dad? I asked after a long pause. What do we do about him? Emma's expression darkened, and she looked down at her hands. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I can keep living this lie, but I also don't know how to tell him the truth. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. The truth, once it came out, would change everything. There was no going back from that. But keeping the secret felt just as impossible. I stood up, pacing the room as the anxiety gnawed at me. This is a mess, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I don't know how we got here. Emma watched me quietly, her expression unreadable. I didn't want this to happen, she said softly. But now that it has, we have to face it. We can't keep pretending. I stopped pacing, turning to face her. So, what do we do? Do we just sit him down and tell him everything? The thought of having that conversation made my stomach churn. I could already imagine the look of betrayal on his face, the anger, the hurt. It was enough to make me want to run in the opposite direction. I don't know, she repeated, her voice shaky. I don't know if I have the courage to tell him, but I don't think we can keep this secret forever. It's only going to get worse. I sank back into the chair, feeling completely overwhelmed. I never wanted to be part of this. I don't want to hurt him. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly. Neither do I. But maybe the truth is better than living a lie. I didn't respond right away. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of a situation that had spiraled so far out of control. But deep down, I knew she was right. The truth, as painful as it was, might be the only way forward. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. If we're going to do this, we need to do it together. We owe him that much. Emma nodded, though she looked terrified. Together, she echoed. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple. We'd sit down with Dad and tell him everything. We'd explain what had happened and take responsibility for the mess we'd created. But as simple as it sounded, the reality of it was far more daunting. As the hours passed, I felt the dread building inside me, knowing that everything was about to come crashing down. There was no easy way to break someone's heart, no way to soften the blow of betrayal. And yet, it had to be done. Later that evening, when Dad came home, Emma and I exchanged a glance, knowing that the time had come. My heart pounded in my chest as we sat down at the dinner table, the three of us, just like any other night. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything would change. Dad looked between us, sensing the tension. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for mine under the table. I squeezed her hand, a silent show of support, as she prepared to speak the words that would shatter our lives. "David," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "There's something you need to know." And just like that, the house of cards we had built came tumbling down. As the weight of Emma's words hung in the air, I could feel the world shifting around us, the inevitable unraveling of everything we had tried to keep hidden. In that moment, there was no turning back, only the painful truth that would change everything forever.